YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have for you reaction request 176. This is the Ventrue, part of Arch Warhammer's Bloodlines 2 lore series. This was requested again by Brutality616 and is a continuation of my reactions to this series. So, let's get started. In 3, 2, 1. Da da. Da da. Da 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 da.
Warning.
Oh, what's
This
this?
video may contain mild, near imperceptible traces of partisanship and bias. The Ventrue are simply the best clan out there. By a million miles. They are the rightful leaders of Kindred Society, and there is simply no argument against it. There are only arguments for it. I mean, look at the competition. The ones we've looked at already. The Bruiser, a little more than barbaric, blood-drinking piglets rotting around in the mud, oinking loudly as they bat one another over the snout. And the Tremere, basement-dwelling has-beens, locking themselves in deep, dank, windowless cellars, pungent with the stench of abject failure, as they try for the 666th time to summon a succubus, so they can know what it's like to be loved by someone who isn't their own mother. And the Toreador, don't
Wow.
get me started. A clan of degenerate, gender-confused hippies that can't be trusted to look at so much as a child's doodle without being sent into a month-long trance. Trusting them to do anything more complicated than looking fancy and spouting worthless platitudes is an endeavor doomed to inevitable failure. And so really, the Ventrue are the only real choice. I did warn you, didn't I? Right.
Yeah.
The Ventrue.
Fair enough.
I'm going to start this one out a little bit differently than the other ones, because generally speaking, I just talk about the history of the clan, how they came to be what they are today, and so on, and then move into the segment of explaining why you might want to play them, what I like about them, and so on. But with the Ventrue, I really think we have to talk about a different thing first, because it is vital that you understand how they view the idea of leadership for you to really get a good idea of what they are and why they act like they do.
Okay.
Because they get a bit of a bad reputation, and partially because they're often written in a really dumb fashion. The Ventrue can be incredibly interesting if you actually understand how they view themselves and the world. And it all revolves around the idea of leadership. Now,
Okay.
the Ventrue view themselves as naturally noble, as correct, as superior, and they view it as their literal birthright to guide Kindred Society in a better direction. However, they are not the classical cliched, spoiled nobleman prince who's just like, oh yes, I want all of the benefits, all of the privileges, but I do not wish to work for them. Whilst the Ventrue do believe that it is their birthright to be leaders, they also believe that it is their birth obligation to be the best leaders possible. They are workaholics, idealists, people who subscribe to a higher ideal and a code of conduct. They hold themselves to a much higher standard than they do essentially anyone else. You can't be incompetent and be a Ventrue. You'll be pulled straight out. Hell, even being mediocre is probably going to put you at a pretty severe risk of extermination. The Ventrue want to be adored. They want to be respected. They want to be hailed, and they expect all of these things along with a position of leadership. But they will also work for it, tirelessly and continuously, to be the best leaders that anyone could ever be. And this is what is so interesting with them. I swear to you, whoever invented the Ventrue was probably reading a certain poem by one Rudyard Kipling when he came up with them, but then also thought about the reality of the situation. For you see, the Ventrue believe that it is their divine duty to carry the lesser clans and humanity at large to a greater existence, to a better place, to a greater good. And like all greater goods, they see absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever with crushing underfoot anyone who even so much as dares to stop them or hinder them in that pursuit.
Oh, wow.
They consider themselves to be impeccably pure and moral, whilst also never shying away from taking the most heinous and immoral actions. If written correctly, they can be incredibly interesting characters, both villains and heroes, but if written poorly, they are the most boring type of 2-bit corporatist villains you have ever seen. The Ventrue require a good writer to get the most out of them, but by God, they are amazing if you actually understand how they view leadership. And again, this is why they often get a bad reputation, as they are presented simply just as power-hungry megalomaniacs who have no wider view or greater plan than accumulating more personal power and wealth, which is the exact opposite of what the Ventrue are actually after. So, now that I've given you a bit more of a framework, because I really do think this is an important idea for the clan, let's talk about their history. And their history starts all the way back at the beginning, with Cain and his first 2 children. For you see, the Ventrue are of the opinion that they are the oldest of all the clans, with their original sire, Ventrue, being embraced by one of Cain's children. In fact, they think that Ventrue was the first to be embraced of all the antediluvians. And they take a great deal of authority from this fact. After all, if their sire was the first amongst equals, then surely it stands to reason that the sire's children should also be the first amongst the clans. Additionally, Cain embraced Ventrue specifically to seek his advice, his guidance in running the first city, the kindred utopia reigned over by Cain, the immortal, infallible vampire god. And if even Cain came to Ventrue to seek advice, then surely that must be proof positive that Ventrue, and through him his clan, must be the wisest and most forward-thinking of all the clans in Kindred Society. And if their clear mental and leadership superiority, in addition to their seniority, is still not enough to convince you, then they also maintain that Cain gave Ventrue the sacred duty of looking after all of Kindred Society, including even Ventrue's very own sire. But then, of course, the biblical flood came and destroyed the first city. In the second city, Ventrue continued his great duty of caring for all the clans, but the clans had grown unruly, undisciplined, ungrateful indeed. And they bucked and tore and railed against the rightful authority of Ventrue, eventually rising up to murder their own sires, Cain's children. Of course, Ventrue had nothing to do with this, obviously.
Surely
Whilst
not.
others might also maintain that he might have been the ringleader of the whole uprising. And this is where we arrive at another interesting little distinction. For you see, the clan has a fascinating idea of their own history, which they of course maintain to be entirely correct and historical, whilst also being caught on occasion interpreting events in a
Colorful
more
fashions?
beneficial light on certain
beneficial.
occasions. For example, they may occasionally claim that their clan really has nothing to do with their sire, their antediluvian lord, and state that they are the only clan that is not yet still under the complete influence of their antediluvian sire. For after all, there is a great fear in vampire society of the modern knights that the antediluvians will at one point return and wipe out all living creatures on the planet. And the Ventrue are the only ones capable of defending kindred society, for they are the only ones without a true connection to their sire. But when it becomes convenient to do so, they will also claim a strong and personal connection to their sire. After all,
so
he
they
was the
flip-flop
first
a lot.
antediluvian to be embraced by Cain's children, and that obviously gives them seniority, rank, and right to rule. What was that? We denounced him just a bit earlier? Yes, but that was yesterday, and yesterday was so very long ago. And they will try to turn anything and everything to their advantage, even their weaknesses. Those who maintain that Ventrue, along with the other antediluvians, rose up and killed their sires, will say that when Cain returned and cursed them, then Ventrue's curse was perhaps not a curse at all. After all, their curse is simply to have exacting standards, and a certain degree of taste in what they consume and surround themselves with. That doesn't sound like much of a curse, really. It sounds like a mark of distinction, really. A reward.
reward.
A clear sign from Cain himself, the father of all vampires, mind you, and the ultimate authority, that the Ventrue are clearly supposed to be entitled to the best the world has to offer. And the other clans should, of course, do their part in gratitude for Ventrue leadership to provide such things. Can you see why I love them now? They're such sneaky little cunts, aren't they? But, to return to the point, with the fall of the Second City, the Ventrue found themselves in a bit of a pickle. They were leaders, but without a leadership structure to lead and to operate within. What were they going to do now in this new and strange world where humanity was rising to prominence? Well, the Ventrue, of course, figured that the best way would be to make use of these new little monkeys wandering all over the place. And so one of them named herself Artemis and went to a place called Sparta. Yeah, Sparta, where she created a nice little hierarchical, militaristic society where all of the warriorish menfolk were striving toward self-perfection and the clean brutality of violence. At this point in history, the Ventrue very much so subscribed to the idea that might makes right, and this philosophy brought them into a fair bit of conflict with neighbouring city-states, which had their own vampire influences, like, for example, the Bruiser of Athens. Remember, they used to be a very, very different clan back then. But eventually, Sparta was not enough for the Ventrue. They realized that a simple warrior society was not going to be quite enough. They needed warriors, they needed a military, they needed a way to exert their power upon those who were not intelligent enough to see the clear and inherent superiority of their rule, and so they went to Rome, where they turned what was once fairly basic bitch barbarians fighting in phalanx formation with pointed sticks like everybody else, into one of the finest, most well-drilled and organized war machines in all of human history. And the original intention behind creating Rome, at least in the minds of the vampire who essentially freed them from the Etruscans, a kindred by the name of Colet, was to create a unified entity, under his command, obviously.
Yeah.
The humans would have their own governance, but it would be controlled entirely from the dark of night, and an organization called the Eternal Senate. This would be a group based upon the Roman Senate itself, albeit far more limited in numbers, and all of the clans were allowed representatives. But Colet had, of course, no plans whatsoever to allow this to function in any kind of a democratic fashion. After all, one can hardly expect the other lesser clans to know what is good for them. That is just silly. And so Collett rigged the Senate in many interesting and subtle ways, ensuring that the entire body was constantly occupied in infighting and various conflicts between the senators themselves. They had to vote on new members constantly, and the voting process itself was laden in such a fashion as to encourage as much infighting as possible. This, again, meant that all of the senators were constantly struggling to maintain their own position against a never-ending stream of competitors, which allowed the prince, the ruler of the Senate, to do virtually anything and everything he wished. He granted the Senate the power to overrule any of his decisions whenever they wanted. He granted them the power to advise him on any decisions. He granted them what looked, at first, to be complete and utter power, but he was simply just a means to an end. He was simply there to execute the wishes of the Senate in the ways the Senate wished them to be executed. But due to the never-ending infighting, in reality, Collett was able to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, as he could always find one or two senators to aid him in his own goals, entirely for their own benefits as well, of course, and therefore he could block any Senate motions launched against him. He could stop any veto, any instructions, and any other things that might complicate the process of rulership. And it worked like a dream, until, unfortunately, the poor Collett was murdered. And his successor, one Titus Ventrus Camillus, had other ideas. He did not appreciate the Eternal Senate. He did not see the beautifully subtle mechanic that his predecessor had put in place. He was far more interested in mortal politics, and believed that the clans should work alongside the mortals rather than try to manipulate them from the shadows. He would preside over the Roman Republic all the way up until his transition into an empire. And he would also be the ruler of Rome during the wars against Carthage, which eventually ended in the destruction of the city and the utter annihilation of the Bruza's great experiment. Something that neither clan is particularly fond of remembering. The Bruza, of course, hate the Ventrue for crushing their great experiment, whilst the Ventrue view the Bruza as a warning, as a sign of what can happen if one truly begins to fall from grace, if one relaxes one's grip over kindred society and one's own clan. A true nightmare for a clan like the Ventrue. But, unfortunately, no good thing ever lasts forever, and eventually Rome grew decadent, corrupt, weak and frail until it was irreparably shattered, and the Ventrue had to move their seats of power into Europe. Now they were no longer in control, but they quickly began infiltrating the various courts throughout the land, and became instrumental in spreading the feudal system across Europe, viewing it as a perfect tool that they could work inside of, whilst manipulating and outright controlling if necessary, while still maintaining a certain degree of anonymity. And as countless great powers in Europe rose and fell during the period of the Dark Ages, the Ventrue continued to bounce around the continent, attaching themselves to the Holy Roman Empire, then to Italy, Venice, Milan, Rome once again, then back to France, and so on and so on, ever seeking the greatest concentration of power from which they could influence the greatest quantity of kindred. But the period also had a deep effect upon the Ventrue. Many of the ideas developed by the humans during this period were deeply appealing to the clan. Ideas such as chivalry and personal honor was something that the clan considered supremely interesting. The ideas of having a strict code of conduct that elevated one group of people above another, not merely due to a birthright, although that too was included, but also through a strict personal regime, and the idea of honor as well. Honor was something special, something to be lauded and respected, universally so, and it was also something reserved for a certain group of people. A peasant cannot truly have honor, but a merchant prince, a fine knight, a good king, or a valiant prince, all of these have the nobility required to truly exemplify both the laws of chivalry and the demands of personal honor. However, despite this, many Ventrue still longed for the days of eternal Rome, when they were at the heart of the world and could pull the strings of power in a far more obvious and direct fashion. Then, of course, came the anarchs, the wars, the revolutions, and all of the chaos that came with it, resulting eventually in the founding of the Camarilla. Oh, what a wonderful idea that was. A unified power structure for all of kindred society, inside of which the Ventrue could operate while still also maintaining their cover, influence, power, and, of course, wealth within human society. One says that even a broken clock is right twice a day, and clearly this was the case when a certain Toreador we have talked about previously suggested the establishment of the Camarilla, and made such a convincing argument for it, one would almost think that maybe he had a bit of prodding from the Ventrue. No, of course, that must have been the case. No Toreador could have come up with something quite so eloquent and perfect on his own, obviously.
Of course.
And this is even further demonstrated by the fact that even now, in the Victorian age, the Ventrue have simply gone from strength to strength to strength. Whilst the Bruiser had the destruction of their great experiment in Carthage, the Toreador had the vanishing of the Dream, and the Tremere having no end of troubles with constant wars, and of course the Diablerie problem itself. The Ventrue truly have only ever been going upwards. Now yes, there has been some minor setbacks like the fall of Sparta and Rome and the collapse of various European powers during the Dark Ages, but these were all human failings and in no way reflects the fallibility of the Ventrue. Of course not. Don't be silly. But the Victorian age was truly a golden age. Not only was the Ventrue in possession of much of the political power in society through their high-ranking positions within nobility and the feudal class, they could now also expand into the rapidly growing new rich of the middle class. They could become factory bosses, barons, explorers, colonizers. The world was truly beginning to open up for the clan, with all of its myriad possibilities, and they began extending the reach of the Camarilla to all corners of the earth, with the exception of China. The Far East is a silly place, and no right-minded vampire would ever go there, obviously. But the Ventrue's lust for power, for expansion, and for ever more things began to bring them into conflict with the other clans. The other clans had their own needs, their own goals, and their own ideals. And the Ventrue were beginning to impose upon those ideals. During the Dark Ages, the world was a truly vast place. The Tremere could carry out their little experiments over in Romania. The Toreador could carry out their own nonsensical ideas of art and beauty in Italy. And the Bruiser, well, they had more than enough problems of their very own to deal with, if they weren't also supposed to deal with some power-hungry cunts in one of the great clans trying to push them around. The Ventrue made a lot of enemies during the Victorian Age, but they also became consummate diplomats, making enough in the way of compromises and overtures to the other clans to keep them more or less in line, although the ambitions of the Ventrue was at one point damn near close to tipping the entirety of the Camarilla into infighting and oblivion. And even today, many would say that the Ventrue are almost as big a threat to the Camarilla as the Sabbat. And, by the way, may I just go on a bit of a side tangent here? Because, you see, World of Darkness essentially claims that all of human history was guided and controlled by vampires. And in the case of Clan Ventrue, I can certainly see it. They are power-hungry, power-mad, one might even say, and they would try to create a society that has a strong hierarchy and can be bound through chains of loyalty, duty, honor, and constant self-improvement. And yet, during World War II, where the Nazis were around, a extraordinarily state-ish regime that demands absolute obedience, loyalty, and all of the things the Clan Ventrue are so very, very fond of, suddenly their influence is nowhere to be seen. Not to mention the other great powers too. During the Second World War, just all of the clans just disappear. Suddenly, no strings are being pulled. The Soviet Union had nothing to do with vampires. Stalin, entirely human. Hitler, entirely human. The nuclear bombs, again, human stuff. For a World of Darkness that has some pretty damn spicy themes on occasion, the convenient plot hole that is the Second World War is quite glaring, isn't it? Anywho, in the final nights we find Clan Ventrue once again in positions of power. Their wealth and influence during the Victorian Age has allowed them to become particularly influential in America. They were able to buy up huge swaths of land, which they then rented out and traded upon, becoming railway barons, real estate magnates, and cotton kings. Today they have firmly established themselves within the last true superpower on the face of the planet. But their many enemies that they have cultivated over the years are beginning to become impatient with their leadership. And in addition to this, Clan Ventrue's high ideals, their nobility, has also been put to a severe test. The new world that works primarily on money, power, and influence has little true room for chivalry like the good old days.
Yeah.
And sadly, many Ventrue in the final nights are becoming far more uncouth and adapting an attitude and morality unfitting of their glorious ancestry. The Ventrue have always been willing to do whatever it takes to gain and remain in power, but there are certain limits, certain elements of decorum that must always be maintained for the sake of the clan's honor and dignity. There may come a time when certain elements within the clan will require cleansing if the degeneration of the modern knights are to continue. And then of course there is the rising threat of the Ventrue Anti-Tribu, the one and only true break-off clan of the Ventrue. Granted, there is also the El Hijazi, an Arabic version, but they are not particularly different to the true Ventrue. It's just that they favor Islam over, well, the more Western ideas and religions. But the Ventrue Anti-Tribu are quite different. They have adopted a certain view on chivalry, shall we say. They consider themselves to be knights, paladins, holy warriors indeed, of kindred society. And thus they consider themselves to be the purest, most undiluted and honorable and honest of all of the vampires. For they view the world very, very simply. As a part of the Sabbat faction, they are of the belief that they represent the true ruling class of the world. All other vampires should submit themselves to their authority, and their authority alone, and not just vampires. Whilst the Ventrue are happy to work within the confines of mortal society, the Ventrue anti-tribu think that the mere mortals of the world are nothing but cattle and slaves,
Wow.
who should work in the name of their superiors, their lords and masters. They should still be allowed to exist as a part of the great plan, but to allow them to exist in any way, shape, or form as the equals of kindred, that is the most vile and unbecoming idea imaginable. And of course, that means that any kindred as well that submit themselves to Camarilla rule, traitors of the worst kind, deserving only of a swift and merciless death.
Wow.
And considering the instabilities of the modern knights, and the long and arduous climb to power of the Ventrue, and the simple fact that nothing ever lasts forever,
Yeah.
perhaps death will
Nothing.
eventually find the clan. Perhaps its various contradictions and problems of opinions, of chivalry, whilst also maintaining power at any cost, might see the clan fall apart. But, for the moment, the Ventrue still remain at the top, at the apex of an organization that they helped create and, these days, essentially run. And on the American continent, there is no single clan more powerful than the Ventrue.
Nice.
Right. And with all that said and done, let's talk a little bit more, shall we? So I already talked about that idea of leadership, so I'm not going to go over that again, but why would you want to play a Ventrue? Well, why wouldn't you? I keep saying that, but this really is just the best example. The Ventrue are awesome. They're great. I mean, they are a clan that allows you to play any kind of power-hungry or extremist personality. You want to play a conceited noble? You can do that. You want to play a local warlord, a crime boss, a leader of a gang, or perhaps somebody who is extremely idealistic, somebody who wishes to gain powers through nothing but noble means, or alternatively, someone that sees a certain nobility in dishonesty, who sees the pursuit of power in and of itself as, well, a beautiful and pure thing, because that does exist. I mean, if power is the ultimate goal, and power for the Ventrue is in and of itself a greater good, because the Ventrue will always, of course, rule in such nice and loving ways, then surely pursuing power at any cost must also be in the name of the greater good, right? The greater good. See, this is why I love the Ventrue, because the idea of the greater good is just such a deliciously, how do I put it, subversive idea. We can all agree that some things are in the name of the greater good. You know, a sacrifice. If you sacrifice one thing for a bigger thing, surely that is for the greater good, right? Sacrificing one person to save 100, surely that's the greater good, right? It's intrinsically good. And that's the beauty of it. Because once you have defined something to be in the name of the greater good, then, well, it's the greater good. And if it truly is the greater good, then anything and everything must be justified, right?
Justified.
Because if anything isn't justified, then, well, it isn't the greater good, is it? If there is some limit that you are unwilling to cross, well, either you simply don't believe hard enough, or your ideals aren't pure enough. I love that idea so much, because it's so deliciously evil. It can be used to justify literally anything. It's a great thing. I love it. And again, if done correctly, oh, this has the potential to lead to some absolutely amazing storylines. So, let me take an example from modern day pop culture, shall I? Thanos from Avengers, yeah? Personally, I didn't like the second Endgame. I thought it was way too much waffle, but Thanos is an excellent villain. Less so in 2, honestly, because his entire motivation is, okay, the galaxy is falling apart. You know, shit's going terribly everywhere. You know, it's not good. And the problem, as far as I'm concerned, is that there's too many people. There are so many people, in fact, that they just tear away at societies that they build. They make the world a lesser place by their very existence. And if they are actively a threat, both to themselves, the worlds they inhabit, and, well, existence practically, then surely wiping out half of them and therefore restoring balance is a good thing, right? The greater good, after all. I love the Venture. I really do. And on an entirely unrelated note, by the way, if you've heard some vague sounds in the background, hooting-ish sounds, I don't think they should be audible, but they might be. Those are owls. I live in the middle of the goddamn forest, and I'm recording at night because I've been so busy this week. I haven't even had time to record the Ventrue video until now, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning when I'm actually done recording this. And it's the fucking time of the owls. Yes. Not shitting. This time of year, they're basically flying around raping one another loudly. Really, really loudly. And that whole screaming thing, that's basically them just going like, hi, I'm horny. Fuck me. Please, please, horny, please. I mean, it sounds pretty in a fashion, but, well, once you start to think about the meaning of those pretty little hoo-hoos, yeah, it takes an entirely different turn, shall we say. Anywho, until next time, I have been Arch, and, by the way, if you like these World of Darkness videos, please do consider sharing them around, because apparently I've pissed off Google. It's getting throttled a wee bit, I can see it from my algorithm, so if you could be so kind as to plaster it a little bit around the place, feel free, I'd be ever so thankful.
Well,
and of course,
I always advertise for you,
have a
buddy.
good day.
Okay, well, let's discuss what I learned. There's actually a lot of amazing stuff in this. The first one, Arch is apparently a very big fanboy for this group. How they view leadership. They find themselves natural and noble, but from the start they found that they were obligated to be the best leader, not just given leadership for no reason. Often craving all for the greater good. What a potentially dangerous concept the greater good has always been. Often crushing all that gets in its way of said greater good. Eventually, they ended up they find themselves, the reason for this is apparently they were blessed directly by Cain's children. And they also like to mix up their history to benefit them, even when it's in a negative sense. They find a way to flip it around to a positive sense, so they like to flip-flop a lot. As long as it still remains in the realm of truth, it still benefits them. Believing that the curse they were given was in fact a blessing, because after all, why could it be wrong? Artemis ended up going to Sparta, running Sparta for a while, which eventually went to Rome. Ran through the Dark Senate, which was often rigged for infighting so that they could keep proper control over everything. After Rome shattered, they adopted human concepts that were introduced, like chivalry and honor. leading to the Camarilla, which was great because, well, they crave being the best leaders. And often hiding throughout America. The only faction that seemed split off was the Anti-Tribune, which find themselves as highly divine lords, meaning they're not, besides the fact of working for you, you work for them. So this is when it's finally split off and the noble part takes over, and it stops being so much about them earning you, you must earn them kind of concept. What an interesting group. A truly interesting group. I can understand why Arch truly seems to fan out about this one, and yeah, it's quite entertaining to boot. Anyways, this was part of Arch Warhammer's Bloodlines 2 lore series. It was requested by Brutality616. Thank you for requesting that. If you want to see more of Arch's stuff, you can look it up yourself, or there's a link in the description to help you find it. So, go check it out. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Willie, out.
If you liked the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to leave a comment. Have a good one.
Let us try to make